What if your depression is not a defect, but a message? A call from the depths of your psyche asking you to listen, really listen, to the parts of you long forgotten. Today, we explore why depression may not be your enemy, but your hidden guide, that there is a peculiar kind of suffering that does not scream. It does not cry out or ask to be seen. It simply sits. Heavy, quiet, persistent, like a stone at the bottom of the sea. We call it depression, and we often treat it as an enemy to be conquered, a problem to be fixed. But in truth, it may be something far more mysterious, far more vital to our inner life. In the language of the Psyche, depression is not simply a malfunction. It is a summons. When the conscious ego, the part of us that believes it is in control, strays too far from the deeper self, the unconscious responds, not words, not with logic, but with feeling, mood, dreams, but often silence. This silence can be unbearable. We feel drained, detached, stripped of joy. The very things that once gave us meaning begin to feel hollow. But this emptiness is not without purpose. It is a symbolic descent, a pulling inward, into the forgotten chambers of the soul. Carl Jung often warned of what he called the psychic infection of the modern age, not one of viruses or flesh, but one of meaninglessness. When the soul is neglected, when the inner life is ignored in favor of surface pleasures or rigid identities, the unconscious pushes back. Depression is one of the most powerful ways it speaks. It withdraws our life force from the outer world and calls us into the depths. It isolates us not to punish, but to prepare. Something within us seeks birth, a new orientation of being, a reordering of values, a confrontation with truths we've long buried. If you find yourself in the grip of depression, ask not only, how do I make this stop? But also, what is trying to speak through me? The darkness, while painful, is not purposeless. It is the womb of transformation. Within it lie fragments of your unlived life, your neglected desires, your disowned emotions, all waiting to be reclaimed. The modern world rushes to label and medicate, to distract and move on. But the psyche is ancient. It does not move at the speed of society. It moves at the rhythm of myth, of archetype, of dream. Depression, in this view, is not a disease. It is a message from the depths of your unconscious, whispering that the current structure of your life is no longer sustainable. Something is dying, and something else, something deeper, longs to be born. We are taught from a young age to show only what is acceptable, to smile when we feel sorrow, to be polite when we are angry, to follow the rules even when our soul screams in protest. Over time, what happens to all those forbidden emotions? The grief we never expressed, the desires we were told to be ashamed of, the rage we buried deep inside, they do not vanish. No, they descend into the unconscious, into a realm Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not a monster hiding under your bed. It is simply everything you have pushed away from consciousness. It is every part of that you have disowned in order to survive, to be accepted, to feel loved. But these rejected parts do not die. They live on, repressed, silenced, and waiting. And when they are ignored for too long, they find ways to return, often through the dark mirror of depression. Depression, from this perspective, is not only sadness. It is a psychic implosion caused by the weight of unexpressed truth. The psyche, having suppressed too much for too long, begins to collapse under its own false structure. You may find yourself feeling heavy, disconnected, without reason or explanation. This is not random. This is your shadow knocking. When you feel depressed, it is often the sign that something within you has been abandoned. A part of your authentic self has been cast into exile. The unconscious will not tolerate this forever. It begins to revolt, not violently, but silently, through fatigue, numbness, emptiness. These symptoms are not the problem. They are the signals. Imagine the shadow as an inner orphan, a part of you once vibrant, now locked away in a psychological basement. Depression is the moment when the cries from that basement grow too loud to ignore. The danger is not in having a shadow. We all do. The danger lies in denying it, in pretending to be whole when we are secretly split in two. As Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, by making the darkness conscious. The repressed self is still alive, still waiting for recognition. Not to harm you, but to make you whole. In this way, depression becomes the threshold, the gate between the false identity you've built and the fuller, messier, truer self that has long been buried beneath it. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the distractions of the day have faded, many feel a haunting emptiness rising within. It is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives as a soft ache in the soul, an unnameable discontent, a whisper that says something is missing. This is not simply emotional fatigue or tiredness. This is the slow erosion of meaning, a loss more devastating than pain itself. And often, it is this emptiness that gives birth to depression. Carl Jung understood the hunger of the soul. He knew that man could endure suffering, even great suffering, if it had meaning. But when suffering becomes senseless, when joy feels disconnected from purpose, when we are surrounded by stimuli yet starving for significance, the psyche begins to fracture. The self becomes fragmented, not by trauma alone, but by the absence of a guiding myth. Modern life has advanced in many ways, yet it has done so by discarding the sacred. Our ancestors had ritual symbols, gods, and stories to carry them through suffering. They looked to the stars, to dreams, to ancestors for guidance. Today, we look to algorithms. We are told to perform, to achieve, to consume, but not to be, not to wonder, not to feel deeply, not to ask what it all means. And in that vacuum, depression grows like a vine in the dark, winding itself around the heart of who we are. The fragmented self is not a failure. It is a symptom. It reveals that the story you have been living no longer holds, the life you've been told to pursue. Success, image, productivity may have brought you status but not substance. The ego may thrive in the spotlight, but the soul starves in it. Meaning cannot be manufactured. It must be discovered. It is not given from the outside. It must rise from within. Depression, then, is not just an emotional state. It is the soul's rebellion against a life without depth. A quiet protest from the inner world saying this is not enough. And until we hear that call, until we begin to ask the questions we've been too afraid to face, we remain split. Functioning on the outside, while dying slowly within. The psyche cannot bear a life devoid of purpose. It demands meaning. And when that demand goes unmet, it retreats, leaving us to wander in a fog of confusion, yearning not for happiness, but for something far more sacred: wholeness. There comes a time in every life when the light begins to dim, when the path forward disappears beneath our feet, and we find ourselves slipping, not by choice but by necessity, into a deeper realm. This is not a fall in the ordinary sense. It is an archetypal descent, ancient and unavoidable. Depression in its deepest form is not merely a mood or a medical state. It is the modern echo of a timeless journey told in myths, carved in stone, whispered through the ages. Jung believed that each human life is shaped by archetypes, universal patterns of the unconscious that reveal themselves in our dreams, in our crises, in the stories we live out without knowing. And among these, there is one that reappears again and again: the descent into the underworld. In ancient myths, the hero or the soul must travel into darkness, into Hades, into the forest, into the cave, not to be punished, but to be transformed. It is in the darkness that the treasure is buried. It is in the descent that rebirth begins. When depression seizes us, it is easy to believe we are broken. But what if we are not broken at all? What if we are being pulled into the same mythic pattern that guided Dana through the inferno, that called Persephone below the earth, that led the wounded healer Chiron to his sacred wound? The descent is terrifying, yes. We lose our orientation, our familiar identity dissolves. What once made sense no longer holds. But this collapse is not the end. It is the threshold. To descend is to enter the domain of the unconscious, to meet what we have avoided, to face what we have hidden. And it is in this encounter, painful though it may be, that the seeds of transformation are planted. Depression becomes not just an obstacle, an initiation. The soul is not interested in comfort. It is interested in growth and wholeness and awakening. And growth requires death. The death of the false self, death of illusions, the death of all that no longer serves the deeper truth within. This is why the descent matters. Not because it feels good, but because it is real, because it strips away the layers we've worn to survive and brings us face to face with who we truly are. Not as society sees us, not as the ego constructs us, as the soul knows us, raw, vulnerable, and waiting to be reborn from the ashes of everything we thought we were. There is a sacred process that every soul must undergo, a process Carl Jung called individuation. It is the journey of becoming who you truly are beneath all masks, roles, and illusions. It is not a journey toward perfection, but toward wholeness. And curiously, perhaps even painfully, suffering is often the gate through which we must pass to enter this path. Depression, in all its weight and mystery, often marks the beginning. We are conditioned to flee from suffering. We are told to fix it, to silence it, to numb it with distraction, medication, or denial. But the psyche, the deep inner self, cannot be silenced forever. It does not break through with violence. It collapses inward. The pain of depression is not random. It is intelligent. It is purposeful. It signals that the current structure of your life is no longer aligned with your inner truth. The self you've built, perhaps to meet expectations, to please others, to survive the world, has grown too tight like a skin you've outgrown, and now it must break. This breaking is not destruction. It is initiation. Depression strips you of what is false. It removes the scaffolding of identity you once clung to. It makes everything uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, the unconscious begins to stir. Symbols, dreams, archetypes rise from the depths. The ego resists, frightened of losing control. But the deeper self waits patiently, whispering through the pain, come closer, look within. There is more of you to be found. Individuation begins the moment you stop asking how to escape the suffering and start asking what it's trying to show you. Each tear, each sleepless night, each numb morning is not simply a symptom. It is a message. The self is not trying to punish you. It is trying to awaken you. The suffering asks you to confront the parts of yourself you've abandoned, the inner child still aching for safety, the dreams you cast aside, the rage you were taught to repress. To bring them back into awareness is to begin healing, not by removing the pain, but by understanding its roots. Jung knew that the way out is not up, but down, not through avoidance, but through descent, through sitting in the fire until what is false is burned away. What remains is not a perfect person, but a whole one, someone who has walked through her own darkness and emerged bearing the wisdom that only suffering can reveal. There comes a moment, subtle and often unannounced, when the long night of the soul begins to soften. After the descent, after the silence, after the aching emptiness that has gripped the spirit, something stirs. It is not a sudden burst of joy, nor a dramatic transformation. It is quieter than that. It is a new awareness, fragile, but real, the return with new consciousness. Carl Jung saw this not as the end of the journey, but as the beginning of a new one. For the individual who has endured the depths of depression and walked consciously through its terrain does not return unchanged. You come back to the surface carrying something with you, a piece of your soul that had long been buried, a part of your truth reclaimed from the darkness. And with it, a deeper knowing. You may look the same to others, speak the same words, play the same roles, but within, you are no longer the person you were. The world, once flat and mechanical, now appears layered with meaning. Symbols reveal themselves where before there was only noise. Emotions arise not only to be managed, but to be understood. Relationships shift, priorities rearrange. The outer life bends to the quiet transformation that has taken place within. This is the gift of the descent, consciousness. Not the intellect's knowledge, but with the soul's awareness. The understanding that suffering has shaped you not for punishment, but for depth. That the darkness you feared was not the enemy, but the teacher. The depression that once felt like death was, in fact, a doorway. And now, standing on the other side, you see things differently. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. Jung often wrote that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This is the essence of transformation. Not avoiding the darkness, but integrating it. Not escaping the pain, but letting it forge you into someone whole. And so the return is not a return to who you were, but a return as who you truly are, your authority. With eyes that have seen the void and found vision. With a heart that has been broken and now beats with greater strength. With a soul that has to despair and emerged with wisdom that can never be learned in books or borrowed from others.